So hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Paul Reckret. I teach political and international theory here at Richmond University, and I'm joined, as you can see, by Professor Dominic Alessio and Dr. William Alcorn. I'll introduce them both, and then I'll talk a little bit about this evening's event. So I'll start with Dom Alessio. He is a professor of history here at Richmond. He's also a fellow of the Center for the Analysis of the Radical Right. He's a post-colonial political and cultural historian of imperialism, and he also has interests in the history of the radical right. He's currently working on a political history that investigates definitions of empire and diverse methods of empire formation, and this includes the buying and renting of imperial territory, the role of non-state actors in the imperial process. He's also working on a project examining the relationship between the extreme right and the occult, heathenism, and Satanism. And I imagine that will be some of the work he'll be presenting today. I'd tell you a little bit about some of his publications across the study of post-colonial history and the radical right or far right, but there are far too many to mention. He's published very, very widely across both of those areas, and I'm very pleased to have him here and very interested to see what he'll be discussing with us today. We've also got Dr. William Alcorn with us. He's the Associate Director of the Center for the Analysis of the Radical Right and is responsible for helping guide the strategic direction of the center, amongst other work. He's a specialist on anti-Islamic protest movements and radical right social movements in the UK and Western Europe. He's recently published a number of papers and I think policy reviews, is that right, William, on counter discourses and counter narratives and in contemporary sort of politics. And I'm sure he'll be discussing some of that work with us today. And the occasion for this joint event between Richmond's Center for the Study of the State Power and Globalization and CARR is a new master's program that we're very excited about to be launching this coming academic year. It's a master's program in the study of security, counterterrorism, and the radical right. It's a very unique and I think exciting partnership between Richmond and CARR. And I think the papers that William and Dom will be giving us today are really going to speak to some of the dimensions of that MA program, insofar as I think Dom will be looking at historical and cultural elements of the contemporary radical right, and indeed its history, as I said, and William will be talking about political and social movements and political discourses and relationship to parliamentary politics of the radical right. So I think to a degree anyway, we'll get a sense of some of the spectrum in which that master's program is going to be examining the radical right. And I think it's also, I mean, if folks want to have a look, that you can find a link on our website, which is down there in small print on the page in front of you. And I think there's also a number of exciting partnerships that are part of that MA. And generally, I think this event is really just a sort of expression of our excitement of the MA program and our partnership with CARR, which I think is really unique on a global level. I don't want to sort of get into hyperbole, but genuinely really excited about this project and about the MA program and our partnership. So with that sort of not too lengthy introduction behind me, I'm going to turn it over to Dom and then to William. In terms of format today, they're each going to speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll hold a discussion. Perhaps we can have a bit of discussion after the first paper, after your paper, Dom, and then we can turn it over to discuss William's paper, and then a wider discussion that I think will probably result from some of the themes that intersect across both of your papers. So I'm going to just turn it over to Dom and give you the board, as it were, and let you get started whenever you're ready. Chances are we'll probably have some technical difficulties along the way, because that's the nature of these things, but hopefully not. So whenever you're ready, Dom, please go ahead.
Thanks, Paul. I'm just loading it up now. Hello, everybody, as I just wait for my piece to pop up. All right, hope everybody can see that. Thanks for being here, and thanks, Paul, for the introduction. It's a real pleasure, and it's exciting to hear about and to work on this new MA with the folks at CARR. Yes, Paul says I teach history at Richmond, but I should also point out that the work which I'm going to be discussing today isn't just mine. I'm working with a colleague, Professor Robert Wallace, and he teaches in the Department of Art History at the Open University. And I should point out by saying that this is what I'm going to give you today is just a wee snapshot of some of the things we're talking about in a new book which we're working on. So the book is a much bigger project, and I've just picked a few things here which I think highlight some of the interesting developments surrounding this topic. So it's not the total thing. And as I said, I'm hoping that when we finish the book, we'll be able to, if there's some gaps in it, I hope you realize it's just because we're limited in time frame to 15 minutes. So I'll begin by saying, as a way of introduction, in Germany in the late 30s, National Socialism seems to have co-opted elements within what we might refer to as paganism. And today the far right appears to be doing the same thing, and sometimes with quite frightening results. And this Breivik, who you see there, who's responsible for killing some 77 people in Norway, he now openly identifies as an Odinist. James Alex Field, who you see above, who marched in Charlottesville in 2017 and was arrested for the murder of Heather Heyer. He also walked alongside a Black Sun flag, which is a Nazi symbol drawing on pagan imagery. And the Black Sun also appeared in the manifesto on the front page and the back page of the Christchurch murder in 2019. Now, this relationship between occult paganism and the far right or the extreme right has not gone unnoticed in popular culture, as many of you probably know. And given the above, it's not surprising to learn that there's a long history of Nazi and neo-Nazi involvement with the occult and paganism. So what Robert and I do in this new work we're developing is engage critically here with some of the ethnicist and racist thinking amongst contemporary far-right religious heathen occult movements in the UK. And in the work, we begin by summarizing the historical context and then explain how heathenry now is also being appropriated. And we focused on a number of more right-wing heathen occult organizations, including but not limited to the Theodenic Rite, Woden's Folk, and also the Order of Nine Angles. But we also want to really make it clear that rather than overrepresent a small but vocal far-right minority, we also are examining the tension between ethnicist and racial heathen groups and the more prevalent non-racist heathens, demonstrating how the majority of these non-racist and anti-heathen heathens try to counter this extremism. The umbrella term we use to approach the contemporary religious phenomena of heathenry is known by a number of additional names, and we've listed some of them here. And within heathenry, a spectrum of beliefs and practices has emerged, which scholars generally agree can be defined in terms of three major ideological strands. There's a racist heathenry, usually associated or often associated with Odinism or Wodenism. There's an ethnic heathenry, and then, as I said, the important point, there's the majority non-racist heathenry. And the focus in this paper is, yes, in the first bit on minority heathens who adopt ethnicist and racist positions, but as I said, also a lot of our work is looking at the majority non-racist position and how these groups try to counter the first two. Now, associations between religion and the far right are not exclusive to heathenry. Yet much of the traditional focus on the far right and religion has been on the links between the churches and fascism. However, it was the Nazi Party which from the very beginning seemed most prone to a kind of pagan-inspired supernatural imaginary. According to Goodrick, it was this kind of niche pagan occult ideology which even helps to explain the rise of the Nazis, especially with their emphasis on things like racial dominance, so-called evil Jews, and a palingenetic vision of Germanic greatness. Now, particularly significant in the evolution of racist paganism was an ideology known as Aeriosophy or Armanism. And this was developed by two individuals in particular, by an Austrian mysticist called Guido von List, and he proposed that Germanic peoples were superior because they were the most recent to evolve from the ancient advanced race of Aryans. And under the tutelage of List and another Austrian also there, better known as Adolf Lanz, Aeriosophy was to have a huge impact and direct influence on Nazism. Now, Aeriosophists claimed that there had once been an ancient golden age, wherein a kind of enlightened priesthood comprised of elite warriors had ruled over an advanced and racially pure Aryan society, which was eventually brought down by a series of catastrophic seismic events. And their idea or belief was that the descendants of this advanced society eventually migrated or were forced to migrate to a new homeland, which they argued could be found in present-day Austria, and that these Aryans arrived in Austria around about 8000 BC, roughly sometime when the lost continent of Atlantis supposedly sank beneath the waves. Now, their idea was that non-Aryans who were worried about the superiority of this Aryan civilization, about it taking over, began deliberately trying to undermine this Aryan colony by proselytizing egalitarianism, that is the Christians, and deliberately introduced a policy of racial intermixing, that is the Jews, with the idea that the bloodlines were mixed, and people were equal, then the Aryan civilization would never come to the fore again. So in order to rebuild a new Aryan empire, Aeriosophists sought to create a number of secret religious orders dedicated to the revival of a lost esoteric knowledge. And Lanz, for instance, thought that the Knights Templars might have been one of these groups. In 1907, Lanz then went on to purchase Burg-Werfenstein, which is a castle on the Danube River, and this castle was to become the home of his new order. And it's from here that he flew, yes, a swastika flag, and he also established his own secret order of knights, known as the Ordo Novi Templi, or ONT. Now, these knights were to be comprised of persons of pure blood, namely, they were to be blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and possess a kind of area heroic figure. Interestingly, Lanz also called for a racial war, where races deemed inferior were to be either sterilized, deported to Madagascar, enslaved, or incinerated, where Aryan women were to be sent to elite stud farms to mate with pure-blooded Aryan warriors, and also where strict marital laws were to be introduced to preserve Aryan wholesomeness. And thus, as you can see at the top of this slide, List was a program, says Gardel, with striking similarities to the National Socialist policies that were to come. Another secret order to emerge out of this Aeriosophic atmosphere was the Germanic Order. It was created in about 1912, and many of its members were actually disciples of Lanz. They were students of Aeriosophy. And they too copied a lot of Lance's imagery. They used the swastika, as you can see here, as the symbol, and they too celebrated pagan festivals. But to hide their revolutionary intentions, the branch had a cover name. It was known as the Tool Society. And in 1918, this society bought a newspaper, the Munich Observer, to propagate their ideas and theories. And then at the end of World War I, they decided to take it a step further and to create a political movement, a political organization. And they created a party known as the German Workers' Party, or the DAP. Then 1 year later, in 1920, the DAP became the NSDAP, the National Socialist Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. And with that newspaper then becoming the Nazi newspaper, the People's Observer. So it's not surprising, therefore, that ideas surrounding Aeriosophy actually permeated elements of Nazi ideology. Although, and I have to be clear here, some folks see that Hitler was directly influenced by them. I have found no direct evidence of this. There's no evidence, proof that he actually ever attended ONT or Tool events. All right, so there's no way I can prove that, would I say that. However, saying that, Aeriosophy was to have a direct impact on other leading Nazis, including Rudolf Hess, Alfred Rosenberg, and in particular Himmler, who was fascinated with these ideas. And he recruited mystics to the SS, such as Karl Maria Villegut, who was a self-proclaimed magus, who advised Himmler to create, as you can see here in this picture, an SS pagan or Aeriosophic Vatican at Wewelsburg Castle, with a black sun, which you can see here, the same thing you saw on the Christchurch Manifesto, decorating its floor. Now, these ideas after the war kind of disappeared, but they were still around from the 50s and the 40s, the 50s and 60s, and part of our work will be tracing some of this. Till today, these ideas began to appear again. And Aeriosophic inspired paganism has been seen by some as a way to unite the right, to now justify a racially pure new order, and to remove again Germanic Christian dominance. And this is particularly evident with a movement known as Wotanism. This is a heathen movement created in the US. There's a longer history on this, but it really came to the fore around the mid-1990s with David and Katya Lane and another individual, Ron McVan, creating essentially with Wotanism what is referred to as a kind of Aryan call to arms. And David Lane is known widely for his creation of the infamous 14 words, which are considered now one of the favorite slogans of white supremacists. And you can read it here in the photo. We must secure the existence of our people and the future for white children. Now, while there's been considerable research now on racist heathenry in North America, the situation in the UK is less well known, and this is one of the reasons why we're doing this new work. The first of our case studies concerns the Theodenic Right, and it was founded in England in the early 70s, and is probably considered the main ethnicist heathen organization in the UK today. And the Theodenic Right promotes a series of 9 charges, which you can just see here on the slide. And the members of these charges, members of the Theodenic Right agreed to adhere to these kind of rules. What's interesting is charge number 6, which you can just see with my arrow there, which says to put no faith in the pledged word of a stranger people. And for us, we interpret this as implying that Odinists should not trust those who are not their people, their racial stock. You can see similar implications, some of these racist leanings elsewhere on their websites, particularly, for instance, in their logo on the left-hand side, which emphasizes faith, folk, and family. And there are lots of references to blood, which reinforce this kind of folkish ethnic thinking, namely that only those with the right blood, that is white, English, or Anglo-Saxon blood, are truly connected to the land. And one of the things we're looking at is looking at followers of these movements, and we can see in a lot of places that there's a lot of emphasis on race and Aryanism in on their web pages. By contrast, Woden's folk is much more explicitly racist in terms of being a heathen organization. So it's a little different from the Theodenic Right. It was formed in the late 90s by a chap called Wolf Ingesunu, who says that he was disillusioned by the lack of progress made by some of the nationalist parties. Choosing Woden, the Old English name for Odin, for a new race and warrior-based heathen faith, Wolf describes his organization as being committed to the awakening of the ancestral Saxon nation. Those are his words. And the homepage of Woden's folk on the website makes striking use of the wolf's angel runic symbol, which you can see there, which we would argue also singles out the organization of having a racist ideology, because this symbol was used by a number of SS battalions in the Second World War. And actually displaying it in Germany today is illegal. Again, because of time, I can't talk too much about who their members are, but we reckon their membership is somewhere between 20 and 50 people. So this is a smaller group. The other end of this far right spectrum is an eclectic esoteric organization which combines racism and occultism and Satanism, but which also co-ops heathen themes. And it's known as the Order of Nine Angles, or the ONA, and it was founded by a chap called David William Myatt in the late 60s, early 70s. There's a picture of him there. Now, a lot of the critics describe his movement as primarily Satanist. But when you read Myatt's writings, he describes it as, and I quote, pagan, and he advocates that worshippers celebrate in pagan sites, all frequently if possibly connected with Adolf Hitler. The ONA also advocates an extreme form of social Darwinism, which criticizes the weak, is anti-Christian, is anti-Jewish, and it too, like ancient Aeriosophy, emphasizes strength as well, but it also emphasizes violence, including to some of its critics, including ritualized rape, random attacks on innocent victims, and you see this on the website, human culling. Now, details about the ONA remain obscure because the organization advocates its members infiltrate, explore, and subvert other organizations and religions. Now, again, because it's quite secretive, we're not too sure about the membership, but one source we came across said it could have as many as 2,000 members globally. The ONA is also important because it's accused of working with or influencing other extremist neo-Nazi groups and globally, including the Atomwaffen in the US and Sonnenkrieg Division here in the UK. As we started out in this chat today, it's really important to emphasize that these groups are not representative of all today's heathens. Most heathens today are not racist, and they're growing increasingly frustrated and angry at the way their religion is being sometimes associated with such movements, and therefore they're taking some activist anti-racist positions. And you can see this again, just a few examples here. This is one which we came across from a group known as Pagan Anti-Fascist Action, who are quite active on Facebook. And they use logos and imagery to counter this neo-Nazi use of pagan symbols. Here's another one. It's an illustration of runes and their meanings. And at the far left, you can see the actual historic name for each rune being gradually replaced with affirmative, increasing the expletive and capitalized statements against neo-Nazi appropriation. Concerns amongst heathens about increasing racist appropriation of their religion by the far right also led to the organization of a special conference entitled For the Forge, which was held in Germany in 2017. And a few years earlier, an organization was set up called Heathens United Against Racism. And the point of their organization is to demonstrate solidarity with inclusive heathenry. So just to conclude, these are just some of the ideas, as I said, that we're movements we're looking at. There are lots of others. There are cultural offshoots there. We're also looking at music, other kind of so-called historical websites. We're looking as well at other heathen organizations and movements. But just to conclude, we want to say that with the growth of an influence of the far right in recent years, one of the reasons we're doing this is we think it's really important to monitor some of these ethnic and racist heathen organizations in the UK. This is especially significant considering that the extremist who murdered the British MP Joe Cox a few years ago, when you read the police reports, the newspaper reports, he had Aeriosophic literature on his bookshelf. The London nail bomber, if you remember from a number of years ago here in London, was a former member of one of David Mayat's former organizations. Jake Angeli, who you might be familiar with, his image is on the top of the slide here, also known as the QAnon shaman, who made global headlines during his participation in the attack on the Capitol in Washington in January of this year. He was influenced by the UK-based Theodenic Right, who we just talked about. And the O9A materials are having a direct influence on UK teenagers, a number of whom were convicted just last year for terrorist offenses and for sexual abuse. So what we're seeing is a common thread going from Columbine, which I didn't talk about in the United States, but they were influenced by possibly black metal music, for Columbine to Christchurch to the Capitol attack. And this is one of the reasons we argue it's of interest. I'd also finish by saying that I won't develop this too much here, but sometimes British fascism hasn't, or variants of British fascism haven't really been focused on too much by academics. And what we're also beginning to see is looking at the post-war years that actually many of these ideas were kept alive in different ways by other groups, by individuals and groups within Britain, and then went to the United States as a result, and also continued to influence the US. So maybe what we were arguing is that British fascism as a movement should no longer be considered just an epilogue or footnote in the history of the far right. Maybe it's probably more important to, it deserves more prominence or more study. And that's it for my 15 minutes. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Dom. That was really fascinating. And I've got a lot of questions for you. The first one that comes to mind comes out of a sort of conversation I had with during an interview of someone who was applying to our MA on the radical right. And it was around the way in which these kinds of symbols and signifiers of paganism and heathenism are circulating globally. So, I mean, we were talking about it in terms of the present and the way that they're circulating beyond Europe even, right? So I guess the question is how you think that, or how you see this stuff, or would describe the sort of circulation of the kinds of traditions, I guess we could call them, that you're talking about historically, but more importantly in the present, and how they're moving from Britain, America, Germany, and beyond.
Yeah, it's funny enough, we're just working on something that we've been working with. CARR knows about this as well. So Robert and I have just, as part of this, we do the odd little publication out of it. And we've just done something on black metal music and National Socialist black metal music. And it's interesting, you see the same thing happen, because in terms of the far right, black metal begins in Britain in the 80s. And then you have some of these ideas and images becoming circulated using the internet, obviously, primarily, but also other channels. And then suddenly it goes from Britain to Norway. And suddenly Norway in the 90s becomes the epicenter of this. You've got murder, you've got a series of church bombings going on. And then from there, it goes to Germany and to the Ukraine and to Poland, and then also to the US. I mentioned Columbine. So obviously social media, YouTube, the internet, these are all having massive impacts, but also some of these bands travel themselves. you do have members of these groups then making their way, say, to the United States, and sometimes being hidden from European authorities who are doing search warrants for them. So I think it's these ideas traveled previously. You did have in the 30s and 40s, in the interwar period and after, you had movements of far-right individuals making their way around. But I think with social media, obviously, it's accelerated this kind of spread. You're still muted, Paul.
Thanks. Feel free to jump in anytime, William. But thanks for that. And for those of you that joined us late because of the size of our audience, we can't open it up to audience questions. But I would add, I'm sure Dom and William would both be happy for you to email them if you want to continue the conversation. But did you want to jump in, William? Because I've got other questions otherwise.
Yeah, no, just quickly, Paul. Thanks, Dom, for that really fascinating talk. It's such a bewildering picture that it's great to have someone with expertise on this to kind of dial into it, because we hear about it in the news quite often relating to neo-Nazi terrorist cases more recently. What I was, as a kind of political sociologist, what I was interested in is what kind of the personal journeys and draws of people within maybe in the more kind of terrorist fringe, but more broadly amongst the far right to more kind of heathen aspects of religion. My work looking at anti-Islam groups, it tends to be adopting kind of a civilizational or cultural form of Christianity in order to kind of build support and build kind of legitimacy away from being kind of explicitly racist. So I was just wondering, Don, what your take was in terms of both the strategic, but also, I guess, the more personal kind of connections. Yeah.
It's I get your point. So I'm going to write these down: personal and strategic, otherwise I'll forget. We're not doing we're in this study, we're not doing individual interviews or anything with members of these groups, because we're charting, you know, the history of the involvement of these ideologies and their influence. I mean, and that, I don't think I would be in it. I probably need a social psychologist to do those kinds of things, or a sociologist. That's not my area here. I would argue that in some cases the journey isn't intentional. So there are people who, understandably, a lot of heathens will emphasize the environment, for instance, and an individual could be really not at home with some mainstream religions, not at home with not having a faith-based a base of faith, and looking for something, and generally interested in these ideas, and they might come across something like the Theodenic right, and not because it's not out there saying, we're neo-Nazis or whatever it is, it's just kind of hidden, and they might generally join in this group really with a real interest to learn more about non-racist hedonism, and then the idea is they might actually just then, when they learn what it's about, they'll either leave, or maybe a few might actually do follow. So I don't know. Those are some of the individual possible routes. I think that it's strategically, I think that maybe there is a bit of trying to be on the borderline a little bit for some of these groups. So they're not clamped down, because we do know that members of National Action, when that was banned, did join groups like Woden's Folk. So maybe it's a way for them to escape attention, or to allow them to continue their activities that way as well. So I think for some it's a personal journey, and for others it's strategic.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. Thank you.
I've got loads of other questions, but I think perhaps this might be a good time to turn it over to William, and I think some of the questions I have are kind of wider theoretical questions that might encompass his talk as well. So does that sound okay to you?
Fine. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Great. Thanks both. Let me just load up my presentation. Sorry, with Teams, it just involves a bit of a wait for the platform to display it. So just give me a second. So hopefully you guys can see that.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I'm going to have a bit more of a look, I guess, at Western Europe more generally, and I'll be looking mainly at radical right parties in this particular talk. I'll talk briefly about street movements, but because of time, it's hard for me to do both in a detailed and thorough kind of fashion. But I don't mind answering questions about both or anything else that I haven't managed to go into detail in this talk. But yeah, it's thanks for Richmond for hosting this, and it's been, yeah, this is a second event related to the new MA, which I've really enjoyed being part of. So yeah, just as an introduction, so I want to look at this party political aspect of the radical rights that's been sweeping through Western democracies, not just since Brexit or the election of Donald Trump, but right back to the 1970s and 1980s, where we saw the breakthrough of Jean-Marie Le Pen's Front National at the European elections. And the main thing I want to focus on here is the extent to which radical right parties, which sometimes are kind of almost, and especially kind of more media representations of the radical right, is this idea of maybe like a barbarian at the gates, or a kind of pathological tendency within our politics. And what I kind of want to argue is that actually they aren't this kind of evil other, but they're actually kind of an extension of some tendencies within our politics more generally, around, yeah, kind of attitudes towards elites, attitudes towards minorities, and also more authoritarian kind of tendencies that we're sadly seeing a kind of a shift, especially if we're looking at Eastern Europe, in Poland and Hungary, as well as kind of the erosion of the broader kind of liberal order when some of these like far right or radical right actors get into power. So I'll be kind of giving my thoughts a bit at the end about whether what the effect has been in terms of the participation of these actors. But what I will start by doing is kind of laying the scene in terms of the origins. Talk a tiny bit about definitions. I don't want to talk forever, but as the kind of the name of this panel suggests, there's we can't see the radical right as being a monolithic entity. As Dom's talk has already kind of laid out, there is a number of ideological positions within the radical right. I'll talk briefly about some of those different forms, and then talk in more detail about what political scientists, that's my kind of political science is my academic background, have talked about in terms of what is involved in the radical right breaking through into the mainstream. And I'll talk also a bit about what happens when they get there. So when the barbarians enter the gate, if I want to extend the rather interesting metaphor that I'll be using. So just starting with the basics, where have the radical right come from? What are the origins of this particularly aggressive and antagonistic form of politics? So if we're talking about the contemporary far right, the intellectual origins, we can kind of first talk about, go back as far as late 1960s in France, especially with the what we call the Nouvelle Droite, the new right. So this is the brainchild of Alain de Benoist, whose picture is there. Timur Baron has written extensively about this group of kind of political actors trying to kind of redress themes within the far right and fascism in a more coded and intellectual kind of fashion, in order to bring about what they termed as kind of a meta-political struggle, in order to basically tip the dial back from the cultural left being dominant towards a more kind of culturally right-wing hegemony, if we're using the words of I can't remember, but anyway, so the new right was opposed to multiculturalism and the cultural mixing of different cultures, which so they were advocating what they called ethno-pluralism, this idea of kind of separate, but kind of separate ethnic groups, not intermingling. So it sort of influenced the cultural climate in the 1970s, and went on to actually inform some of the ethno-differentialist policies of the Front National. And the theorist that I couldn't remember the name of was Antonio Gramsci, talking about metapolitics, which had a slight mind kind of fudge there. So the next kind of set of origins that we can think about in terms of the contemporary radical right, the mainstream radical right, are its sociological origins. So we can suggest that they come from these parties and the groundswell for these parties and their success in places like France, but also in Austria, the FPÖ, the Freedom Party under Jörg Haider, kind of emerges from a kind of a backlash from the 1980s onwards, and the initial success of these parties, and perhaps also we can say this continued appealing success, was what Piero Ignasi, Italian political scientist, talked about as being a silent counter-revolution against left liberalism and post-material values around things like the environment, and kind of sexual equality more broadly, and again this idea of turning the dial back towards a more socially conservative, and obviously in the case of the radical right, strongly authoritarian and xenophobic political positions on the political ideological spectrum. So as mainstream parties began to adopt left liberal values, this, I guess, and this is what Ignasi argues, created an electoral niche on the right for these parties to exploit, especially in relation to more post-material issues, I guess, like immigration, things like, on cultural issues, that they could try to exploit this gap in order to foster electoral success. So finally, the political origins, which come more recently, is related to what Katz and Mayer, they talk about, but particular Peter Mayer, he wrote a book several years back about Ruling the Void, which basically talks about how there was this rush amongst especially social democratic parties for the centre more recently, during the kind of 2000s period, and this has obviously left gaps amongst their traditional electorates, but has also made parties a bit more vanilla in terms of their ideological appeals, so more kind of distinctive radical actors with a particular niche policy program. It doesn't have to be the radical right, but it could be kind of green left parties, but have kind of risen, these minor parties, because of the vacation of distinctive ideological claims for, I guess, a more kind of neoliberal managerial type of politics. So in terms of defining the radical right, I mean, we can talk about this for ages, and it might be something that is picked up in the questions. But Kasmud, in the 1996 article that he wrote, talked about a kind of terminological chaos in the discipline of kind of party studies, but also in the field of far right studies. He was counting lots of definitions, lots of ideological features. I think the best kind of technique that I've come across in terms of defining the radical right is to try and define it in more absolute terms, and particularly distinguishing what we talk about under the umbrella of the far right as being the radical right, being the more kind of mainstream element. So it's not rejecting democracy necessarily, it's performing a critique of democracy, and in terms of the modalities, the behaviours, not just the ideology, that it's a rejection of violence in order to kind of pursue that. And I guess I'm treading on eggshells here, because when I talk about that now, I think about the Capitol riots and some other instances where there's been this blurring between the radical and the extreme right. But I'd like to kind of bracket out those and say that I'm dealing in this talk with the radical right, the more mainstream forms. So in terms of the kind of ideological content, then I'm also borrowing from Casmuda, and he talks about three kind of key features when we're defining the more mainstream radical right. So what perhaps you term as right-wing populists. So this is a nativism, so it's division of society between native in-groups and out-groups. Authoritarianism, which is not just appeal to authority, but authoritarian measures in order to pursue policy positions. And also tagged on, but possibly not as necessary in terms of ideological features, is populism. So that division between pure people and a corrupt elite, and kind of measuring policy decisions through a kind of common sense kind of perspective. So this is a kind of panel about Face the Radical Right. What Dom has covered, I guess, is an overlap between these three modalities, and but we can kind of suggest that there's kind of three modes of operation within the far right. So we have the more paramilitary style organisations. So these are the kind of terrorist organisations. Things like the National Socialist Underground, the NSU, was this kind of cell of far right terrorists in Germany, the late 90s, early 2000s, but also some of the groups that we're seeing more recently, both in the US, like the Base, Atomwaffen, in Australia, Antipodean Resistance, in the UK. Groups like National Action, and then kind of moving towards the more mainstream, we have social movements. So these are protest movements in the UK. These be groups like the English Defence League, I guess more recently Patriotic Alternative, and perhaps other anti-Islam groups. But what I'm going to focus on today is just the political parties, mainly in Western Europe. Your Front Nationals, now the National Rally, and you have kind of the more right-wing populists parts of these parties, and you obviously have the more extreme ones like the NPD in Germany. And what makes this really difficult to study is there are blurrings between these three categories, which I won't go into because it would just confuse the hell out of people. So yeah, I think what's good before I go into looking at what are the ingredients for success is just a caveat about how successful these parties are, because there's a media framing of the inevitability of the success of these parties. So this is a graph from a recent paper by Georgiadou and some co-authors, and they have some handy analyses here of the average support for the radical right in the past kind of 20 or so years. And what's interesting here is that the most successful case of the far right here is Switzerland, and we can see that even then they only occupy kind of 20%, 25% of the vote share space. And if we go and look at the European level, the actual kind of aggregate figures in terms of percentage compared to other parties is also fairly small. It's under 1.5%, and it's even lower if we're looking at more extreme kind of neo-Nazi kind of parties, explicitly neo-fascist, neo-Nazi parties as well. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
Well, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. Well, I do mean to interrupt, but we're at 5:52. We're scheduled to finish at 6. I'm sure we can go a bit past time, but
yeah,
just to keep that in mind.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so in terms of accounting for success and failure, political scientists kind of look at this through the lens of kind of economics. So they talk about demand side factors, so factors that come from below, so what drives demand for these parties, and also supply side theories. And what's been talked about more recently is this conundrum of whether it's economic insecurity and crises that kind of spurn the support for these right-wing populist parties, or a cultural backlash. But actually, when we think about the mixture of factors, I think it's important to also throw in a whole load of contextual factors that relate to the parties themselves, but also kind of the environments in which they find themselves. So party ideology is also a key one. So whether a party is more kind of from kind of a non kind of Nazi milieu is quite important. An article by Elizabeth Carter in the 2000s talks about reputational shields and how parties that, even though were kind of aggressively anti-immigration, if they sprung up from perhaps a more kind of agrarian kind of base or regionalist focus, that they would tend to do better than parties that have roots in neo-Nazi subcultures. Organisation is also key. Having professional activists and members is a key part of the jigsaw, and also the type of leaders that they have. And Kasmurda, he talks about internally facing leaders that are really good at practical elements versus externally competent ones. So people who can kind of create a buzz in the media, and he sort of suggests there should be a mixture of both in order for these parties to be successful and to be seen as competent. And we can kind of see that some of this is being tested in the Front National at the moment, with Marine Le Pen trying to go a more aggressively kind of mainstream route, and some of the kickback that she's been receiving because of that. In terms of electoral law, that's just the extent to which the system supports these minor parties. There's often thresholds for these parties that actually they have to, in kind of more proportional systems, get at least 5% of the vote. It might not be supported by the state as well. Party competition, we've already talked about that in terms of the extent to which the middle ground is being occupied, and there being space for the extreme. One thing that I want to focus on, particularly just on this slide, is the media and political landscape. And I think it's really important to think about how the media kind of lends legitimacy to these parties in terms of how it treats the far right, and the framing of the far right as being legitimate actors, as opposed to kind of imposing like a corner on senator in terms of interviewing them, giving them a platform, etc. And also the political landscape. So how parties, mainstream parties, either shun the far right when it comes to electoral coalitions, or local cooperation. And in a brief thought in terms of that, the only reason why the Front National broke through in local elections and then into European elections was because of the mainstream right, basically cooperating with them in the north of France. So a final consideration is what they do when they get into power. And to kind of cut a long story short here, what we're actually seeing is not perhaps the mainstreaming. We are seeing the mainstreaming of these ideas, but not necessarily the actual parties and politics, parties themselves. It's more what some authors have suggested to be a radicalization of the mainstream that these parties are offering, because they often come into power, fall out. We've seen that with the FPÖ in Austria, but also the Liga under Matteo Salvini. They're very peripatetic in terms of their participation in government. I won't really go into this case study, but it's just an interesting one. Again, basically, this was a coalition between Geert Wilders and Mark Rutte, and basically the PVV, the party of Geert Wilders, stumbled into coalition, and he basically fell out with his party because he was becoming too moderate. So that's just a case study of, and Mark Rutte has been in some instances vilified a lot for adopting some of the key policy positions. So this is just a case of that example of the radicalization of the mainstream. And to try and keep this to time, to kind of conclude, the rise of the radical right has been a media talking point, but we have to kind of bear in mind how small they are in terms of their dominance and how few actual big names parties actually participate in government. And the key influence, therefore, has been this radicalization from the sidelines to the mainstream. And I've just noted a few examples there. And there's some references I can send slides to people if they're interested with this reading list of books, including one which deals with mainstream at the top. So thank you.
Thanks very much. And for those of you in the audience, we were due to finish at 6, but in the interest of keeping this discussion going, and which I think we're really just at the very tip of our iceberg here, we are going to go a bit past time, but obviously understand if some of you need to run off. But thank you again for that, William. I guess my question for you, and perhaps also for Dom in a way, is thinking about the way that, as a scholar of these movements, how tricky it must be given the way in which radical right ideas and far right ideas are being mainstreamed. Not just in terms of extremist parties falling into coalitions in major European liberal democracies, but also in terms of the way one could argue that a lot of these discourses are becoming dominant in more traditional parties, for instance, the Conservative Party in Britain, which some of its wings have obviously taken up a number of these discourses. And then you can find very extremist wings like the sort of spiked people who are advising Boris Johnson, for instance, and of course, there's similar sort of things in recent US history. So I guess, in this sense, the question for you, and then I'll sort of relate this to a question to Dom, is just how one manages the kind of slipperiness in the way in which what's considered mainstream and what's considered acceptable discourse has been shifting so rapidly to the right in recent years. And I was thinking about this in light of your talk as well, Dom, but in slightly different terms, which is, in terms of this kind of spectrum of ideas and spectrum of paganism and heathenism, and whether we can have, or what it would mean to have a progressive heathenist or paganist movement, right? So because obviously there's a long tradition, critical theoretical tradition that argues that occultism is reactionary, inherently reactionary, given its anti-modernism, its anti-enlightenment sort of perspective, or the sort of pastoral elements, for instance, which easily nativism, right, easily slip into extremist views. So that's a way, I guess, of trying to tackle a similar set of questions around how you orient yourself in relation to the kind of spectrum of ideas that we're dealing with.
Yeah, shall I go first, guys? Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's always. I think it's always interesting to think of fringe cases that that were considered kind of radical right and now far right. So like parties like UKIP, I would have said about 5 or 6 years ago, it was kind of more radical right, kind of right-wing populist. But then after the kind of implosion after the EU referendum, it's become kind of more kind of associated with kind of street movements, more explicitly anti-Islam, even though there was kind of the anti-immigration kind of appeals. But yeah, I think if we were kind of studying the far right 10 years ago, which hopefully most people on this call were, it was it's interesting to kind of think about this question of whether the aims of the new rights and the group of researchers in France has now in fact actually become broadly successful, because I mean, if we think of in the UK about kind of the Red Wall and some of the cultural wars and politics that are going on at the moment, there's certainly there's very kind of thin line between what were previously fairly kind of fringe ideas and movements now becoming fairly mainstream. I remember this article I was reading comparing the Conservative Party even under Theresa May, and how certain sections of the 2005 manifesto of the British National Party, for example, wouldn't look out of place with some of the kind of policy positions. So I think it's increasingly hard to find that threshold. Yeah, I guess in that case it's useful to perhaps look at behaviours rather than ideology, particularly espousal of violence. But yeah, be interesting to hear Dom's thoughts as well.
Thanks, Will. Really enjoyed that overview as well. Super fascinating, and to answer both your comments, I would argue, and firstly, I would say, just as an aside point, I don't necessarily view heathenism as reactionary. I mean, in fact, I could even argue that the occult, there are elements to the occult is a big umbrella. And there are groups within the occult who can be quite progressive, quite liberal. I mean, there are certainly, I would argue, spiritualism, although you might question whether or not it's reactionary or not. Certainly a number of its adherents primarily were women, were quite avant-garde, and also during the late 30s and early 40s, the Nazi Party tried to close down a number, interestingly enough, you think, given that link. The Nazi Party tried to close down a number of other occult groups, like parapsychology as well as spiritualism, etc. So I don't necessarily, again, it's the problem is what's the gray? We've got this whole range of different groups, and also thinking of Will's mapping he did by Joe Jadu of the, where the right is. I mean, it's amazing how in a couple of years things can change, because I didn't see Spain on there. Do you know what I mean? And the electoral success of Vox, suddenly you could argue, well, worse, that can change dramatically. And thinking about our COVID pandemic period, I mean, I think one of the answers is, this is why, it sounds like a plug for the MA, but this is why you need to look at this stuff, because there are all these different permutations and variations, from Delta to what it is, the UK variant, and you've got to monitor them, and you've got to be aware of them. And there is always the danger that what can become fringe, as Aeriosophy maybe was, can eventually influence or later on become mainstream. I mean, Christianity starts out as a fringe cult, and look what happened to it. So it's monitoring these things, and then reacting appropriately. That, to me, is why we do this.
Thanks. The other question I have that sort of intersects both of your talks, and I think you touched on, William, but obviously the kind of heathenist symbolism, discourses, ideas are not mainstream, even if radical right ideas are being mainstream. So I wonder if I'm just wondering where that relationship is, right? So so how is it that some of these ideas are sort of and we talked about this earlier, right, Dom? But the way some of these symbols are circulating across cultures and across countries and languages and so on, but aren't quite filling that space, that in a sense, in the way you described it, William, liberalism has sort of left open in a way, or liberalism is subject to giving up, right? This sort of culturalist space. And instead, I mean, you get nativism and you get, ethnocentrism, but not necessarily sort of heathenism and paganism accompanying the sort of rise of these ideologies and these movements to the mainstream. So I guess the relationship between a kind of paganism, heathenism versus the kind of mainstreaming of radical right ideas is what I'm getting at, because I'm just struggling to understand, how some of these ideas are mainstream but others aren't, if you see what I mean.
And the reaction, just before Will gets in, I would argue it's not just heathenism, which you can associate. There's a long history of religion and ideology. I mean, and the same debates occur within the Catholic Church. I mean, on the one hand, you have Croatia, where you have these Catholic priests very much involved with some of the genocide, and yet just across the Adriatic, you have the papacy hiding a lot, 400 or 500 Jews from the Nazis. So and working, hard with their orphanages, etc., and seminaries to save Jews from the Nazis. So again, so hard to generalize, and it's not unique to heathenism. There's a colleague from CARR doing work on Buddhism, the way that Buddhism is being appropriated in the same way. So it's not just this issue is not just unique to, I would say, to heathenry.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that the kind of tendency has been with kind of adopting this more kind of cultural form of Christianity, particularly as we've seen the shift of the far right to kind of targeting Muslims, as opposed to kind of previously that there's still obviously the kind of more overtly biological, what some people refer to as kind of biological racism, so anti-black and anti-Semitic. But what the function of this adoption of Christianity has been is mainly just been as a way of suggesting how, as a way of othering the Muslim communities within the West, and kind of connecting with I guess more mainstream kind of culturally traditionalist kind of forces or mainstream right forces on the socially conservative right end of the spectrum. And yeah, I think it's yeah, we see that in Hungary with Orban talking about creating a Christian democracy. But even at the fringes, we see kind of conspiracy theories used and kind of exemplified by people like Anders Breivik, but also the Christchurch shooter, kind of with this obsession around kind of demographic replacement, and yeah, this kind of idea of kind of this this overpopulation or outpopulation. And then that even goes into this other weird space that we're in at the moment, where we see far-right groups adopting environmentalism and talking about how the depletion of resources and being able to connect that with more racist forms of ideology. So you're just trying to use these kind of jump-off points almost, as Don was alluding to, in terms of personal journeys, people being attracted, not necessarily being kind of perhaps totally aware of the racist kind of aspects, because these groups make them so coded sometimes that it even takes an expert to realize that there is that kind of element creeping in. So it can be very subtle, which I guess is the danger of when we see these fusions kind of happening. Of these actors with more mainstream kind of ideologies and religions.
Thanks. There's a lot to discuss. We're also almost 15 minutes past time. So I don't want to keep people, it's a rare, hot, sunny day here in London. I don't want to keep people too long, but I'd leave it to you both, whether you have anything you want to add before we close, or any sort of thoughts or final things that you feel like need to be said here.
I'm absolutely okay with it. I'm happy if folks have questions to write in and email me directly. I'm happy to try to answer the questions. It would be, and thank you. I was going to say thanks to you, Paul, for navigating and running all this, and to my colleagues at Richmond and to CARR as well for being such great colleagues to work with. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And as I said at the outset, those of you that weren't here, this event is marking the launch of a new partnership between Richmond University and CARR, the Center for the Analysis of the Radical Right, which, and the sort of partnership is signaled by a new master's program, which is jointly offered by CARR and Richmond. It's an MA in Terrorism, Security, and the Radical Right. We're really excited about it. We're really excited about this partnership and continuing the sort of wide breadth of research you've seen some of here today. So obviously there's you can see an email address there if you have any questions about that on the slide, and there's a lot more information about that program and about CARR's work on their website as well. So thank you all for coming along, and as Dom and William said, they're happy for you to message them if you want to keep this discussion going. And thanks for coming, and hopefully you too have sunshine wherever you are and can enjoy a little bit this evening. So thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Dom.
Thank you.